Merhaba, Moshfegh Deniz, probably destroyed that when I was with all languages. Welcome to the second meeting of the workshop on politics and society, hosted by the Department of International Relations at Ozyegin University. Today we are very excited to have Dr. David Moshfegh. I hope I didn't destroy that name, but you all know me as a teacher, I'm terrible with that. Who has a PhD in history from the University of California at Berkeley, a more sunny place, I think, right now in Istanbul, and who will be talking today about, are we at the end of international relations? Dr. Moshfegh has mostly worked on the intersection between our ideas about science, in international relations especially, Orientalism, and Imperialism. And his dissertation was essentially on the impact of Ignaz Ozyegin on the rise of Islamic Wissenschaft as a science of religion. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah,
probably not.
It's basically, where does Islamic studies, European studying Islam, what are the origins of that in the European academic society? I study other academics, basically.
Yes, yes. So he studies us. Very exciting. Future career option. His current work is from cultural.
I don't suggest it.
His current work is from cultural politics to jihad, the rise of Islamic Wissenschaft and German Orientalism in the era of World War I. That is something that is very relevant to Ottoman history, so to Turkish history. Remember the declaration of jihad by the Sultan during World War I. It looks about how that whole discussion and the call by Kaiser William to declare jihad probably came about. So we're really looking forward to an excellent presentation. We're really happy to have you here, and we'll get started on your mark.
And what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to talk about the very idea of international relations. Since you guys are all international relations students, and try to historicize the very idea of international relations. And to do it, I'm going to show you first just a small video that actually has nothing to do with international relations whatsoever. Do any of you know who Jean Piaget is? Famous psychologist. He works on pioneer and developmental psychology, looking at the cognitive development of children. So just 5 minutes, and then it's an interesting video if you've never seen any of his work. If we can get it. There we go. So the sound.
At Maya's age, babies know to look for the object, but they might not have everything else straight. 10-month-old Simon is about to make a classic mistake. Although he watched us place the toy plane under the white cloth, he'll look for it where he last found it, not where he watched us hide it.
Can you look at these two glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice, this glass has more juice, or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more, and why do you think that this one has more?
Because that is taller.
Okay, you ready? Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or do they have the same?
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
at that from where you're sitting? What are some of the things that you see?
And a cat.
A cat.
And a tree and a farm.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. Can you tell me what you see when you look at it from that stool?
An owl.
An owl.
And a hen.
What is that?
A goat.
A goat. Okay, is there anything else you see?
Yeah,
Right there, what is that?
a tree.
A tree.
And that's another little tree.
Another little tree. Right. And can you tell me what I see when I look at this from where I'm sitting right here?
An owl.
Okay.
And a goat.
Mm-hmm.
And another tree. And that. And that.
So first we're going to look at these two cups right here. Do you think there's the same amount of juice in this glass as there is in that glass? They're even? Okay. So we're going to take the juice from this glass and pour it into this.
This is our age. We should watch it here.
Okay, so now we're going to look at this glass and that. So do you think that there's more juice in this glass, more juice in this glass, or do you think that they have the same amount?
Same amount.
Okay, why do you think that they have the same amount?
Just because this is skinny doesn't mean it's not the same amount. It has the same amount of juice in it, but this one is just wider and this one's skinnier, but they have the same amount of juice.
It says, if you hit a glass with a hammer, the glass will break. And then this one says, Don hit a glass with a hammer. So what happened to the glass?
It broke
It broke. Why did it break?
because the handle's hard.
If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break.
No,
And this is the second rule. Don hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
nothing.
Nothing happened. Why didn't anything happen?
Because the feather's soft.
If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. And the second one, Don hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
It broke.
And why did it break?
Because the rule says if you hit glass with a feather, it'll break. So if you hit glass with a feather, it broke.
Okay. So I always start whenever I teach history and in all my humanities classes, I usually start with this. I mean, what I think Piaget was trying to do was to say we usually think of children as young adults, essentially functioning with some of the same concepts as we are, but they just haven't gotten enough of them. Whereas the reality is, by having different concepts, children are actually living in a fundamentally different world than the one that they live in. They don't think about size, for example, in two-dimensional, three-dimensional ways, but in one-dimensional ways. They may not have the concept of conservation of matter. And so essentially, they are living in fundamentally different worlds than we do. And this is the way I see the role of history and of the humanities is, instead of assuming the world that we live in and the concepts that we're functioning with, how do you essentially go and learn more about others, their world? And I try to present this, just as with those children, as a process of cognitive world, that your world essentially becomes bigger as you learn about the worlds of others and their concepts. This is, I think, especially important in trying to understand the idea of international relations in a historical context, because international relations is usually thought of as something that has existed for all history, especially in the 19th century, when people especially thought of nationalities and national categories as almost natural categories, so that as long as there was history, there were French and Germans and history really was a history of these peoples, or people thinking of international relations as, it's always been about power or money. The names essentially change, but the fundamental processes have always been essentially the same. And what I try to talk about to my students is usually try to talk to them about the fundamentally massive historical changes that have happened in societies and in the nature of states since there's been recorded history, that have allowed something like international relations to come into being. International relations, international literally means between nations. And the premise of this talk and the premise of usually the course that I teach on this is that what we call international relations, if relations between states and societies are to be understood in terms of nation states as being at the center of them, that's really something that has existed for about 200 years, since the French Revolution in 1789. And that increasingly that way of looking at the world is becoming more and more problematic, especially after the end of the Cold War. So that what we call international relations can't be assumed as something that encompasses all of history and the relationship between societies and states, but has to be historically circumscribed to a very, very small era of human history. So what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to give you a sense of what were societies and states like in the era, in the pre-modern era, before there were nation states, and so before, as I'm arguing, there were international relations. Where did the nation state come from in world history? And then why are we possibly now at a moment where there are post-national possibilities and identities in terms both of political legitimacy and political identity. So I'm going to first start and focus a lot on what were international relations like before there were international relations. So I think a good place to start is to look at the case of China. Most of the states and societies in the pre-modern era were certainly not nation states. They tended to be either small city-states or very, very large empires. And even large empires were constituted almost in the same way, where you would have some kind of center and then many, many different localities that were really integrated into the empire based on paying taxes, essentially. How did these empires think of themselves and of the world, essentially? China is interesting. The Confucian way of thinking about the world and of the state and of society in general has a very, very long history. I think it comes to its climax probably in the Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, and in the Qing Dynasty that replaced it and ruled China all the way to 1912 and the Chinese National Revolution. If you look at China in Chinese, the Chinese characters for China are literally the Middle Kingdom. And the way in which China thought of itself during this imperial history was basically in terms of an understanding of the cosmos as a whole, and China itself as the center of this cosmos. In this cosmic way of thinking about the world was divided up in a kind of binary way. China was not simply one civilization amongst other civilizations. China simply was civilization. And it was surrounded by barbarians. Right? What in China, civilization is that the person at the very, very hierarchy of the cosmos itself was the Chinese emperor, whose actions essentially regulated the fundamental relationships that constituted the world order in the world, and so civilization itself. And those relationships were the fundamental Confucian relationships. So the five are ruler, subject, father, son, husband, wife, elder brother, younger brother, friend, friend. And that's the relationship that, those are the relationships that the emperor regulated, and on that basis, civilization and order in civilization existed. And barbarians, all of those around China being at the center, could have access to civilization by essentially accepting the Chinese view of itself as civilization. They would do that by paying tribute, which meant kowtowing to the emperor, where you would go and genuflect and essentially accept Chinese supremacy. Although essentially they were paying tribute, they got a lot more from China, usually greater gifts and others for doing that. This was also a way in which war was essentially avoided. But China was civilization surrounded by barbarians. So very much a very binary way of thinking about relationships with other societies and states. And this way of thinking about the world did not preclude that other peoples might come in and take over this system, which had happened many, many times over the course of Chinese history. So there was very much room for the idea of corruption, that the order of these relationships and the way that they were supposed to be would not actually be maintained, and that there would be collapse essentially in the system. When that happened, barbarians could come in and actually take over the whole system, which is exactly, for example, what happened with the king, who came in from Manchuria and took over all of China. But the idea of the system was essentially that the barbarians who would conquer China would in turn be conquered by it, so that they would come to represent the same Confucian way of thinking about the whole world, and that so the system would continue and civilization would reestablish itself. And that's exactly what happened with the king, who after coming in came to represent an idea of the Confucian order and its binary way of thinking about the world, even to a greater extent than me. What this system could not withstand is what happened in the era of European imperialism, when Europeans were not willing to try to deal with China, interact with it on the basis of European supremacy. This became clear through obviously all the wars that the Chinese lost in the 19th century, primarily to the British. But already even before that, at the end of the 18th century, the British ambassador, for example, refused to bow to the Chinese emperor because he said that nations are sovereign and equal, and he's not willing to essentially accept the position of a barbarian, right? So this gives you a sense of the difference in thinking about the world order in this way of the Chinese world order with China at the center of it, and a notion of nationalities which is much more horizontal, essentially. Germans, French, you are one, and you see others like you on the other side. Another way of thinking about how empires conceived of themselves and looked at the world in general is something I like to call universal religious empires. The Byzantine Empire is a good example of that. This is one of the longest lasting empires in world history. You can date its beginning when Constantine moved the capital from Rome to here in Istanbul, which was called Constantinople. This empire, again, did not function by looking at others in a horizontal way, other states and other societies, but very much through its a vertical relationship, in this case with God, just as with an understanding of the cosmos in the Chinese case. And the idea being that the Byzantines had the right message about divinity and the divine order, which was Christianity. And this was the basis of the legitimacy of the empire and the basis on which it made a claim to essentially universal rule over the whole world. Right? The idea was that Christianity as a religion, as a universal religion, was bound essentially to take over the space of the whole world, and that the empire, in the name of Christianity, thus made also a claim to global and universal rule. Now, this way of thinking about imperial rule and imperial legitimacy in the Byzantine case had very much its counterpart also in the case of the rise of the Arab and Islamic empire, which though it became obviously a rival and a very, very different religion, functioned essentially as an empire in the way that it viewed its legitimacy in the same way, in that Islam came to provide a claim to universal legitimacy and universal rule. So, for example, Muslim theologians and jurists came to make a distinction between the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Gharb, meaning the abode of Islam, the abode of peace versus the abode of war. And the idea of waging jihad was to bring the abode of war into the abode of peace, which would be Islam. So again, it made a claim to not only sovereignty over all Muslims, but potential global rule as a whole. As you can see, these ways of thinking about the world also involve a kind of binary way of thinking about the world. In this case, the binary is the believer, the ones who have the right message and represent it, versus those who don't. And you could think that in this case, and with these empires, we might have a kind of broader Christian world which was waging crusade to spread Christianity all over the world, and you would have a kind of Islamic realm doing that with jihad. But the reality is actually much, much more complicated than that, because although these states made a claim to global legitimacy and global rule, the reality is that within each religion, within each great literate religious tradition, which these empires use for their own legitimacy, divisions could happen within those religions and within those traditions. So already by 909 CE, you have a Shia caliphate, the Fatimid caliphate in Egypt, and from there takes over much of North Africa, and including the holy cities and other areas of the Middle East, takes them from the Abbasid Empire. And in 909, you have a caliphate. The caliphate, the idea of the caliphate being claiming essentially sovereignty over all Muslims in the world, and also on that basis making the claim that they are the ones who are representing jihad and the spread of Islam from that point on. So you could have, just as you also have these kinds of divisions eventually between Catholic Western Europe and the Byzantines, for example. Not only could you have divisions within religions, but you could have even amongst, for example, Sunni Muslims, you could have different polities as they emerged, as the Abbasid Caliphate, for the most part, collapsed as a real power. But already in 929 CE in Spain, the Umayyads who had moved there, by 929, Abdurrahman III declares himself caliph in Cordoba and in Spain, so that there was no difference. This was also a Sunni polity, but the idea was that it somehow represented that global claim in a more legitimate way than the Abbasids did, for example, at this point. So important and big states and empires, all of them could make a global claim to rule on the basis of universal religion, but could be rivals to each other. So by this point in 929, you actually have three Islamic caliphs, all of them making the claim to represent all Muslims. And the reality is that even though empires and states tended to see each other through the prism of these kinds of global claims, Christian states would ally with Muslim states against other Christian states, and the same thing vice versa, right? So this was the prism through which people understood relationships between states on a theoretical level, even though practically the reality was that it was a very, very complicated and messy picture. More importantly, in these societies, internally, and this is really the reason why you can't talk about a nation state or really even nationality in any legitimate way at this point, is that the same global claim to rule, the same literate tradition which these states used to make a kind of universal claim to rule, that same tradition, that same literate tradition was used to divide what were the elite in these societies from the masses of people in these societies. These were predominantly agricultural societies in which more than 80% of the people were peasants. And essentially, the people who represented those religious traditions, allied to warrior elites in these societies, used that literacy and the representing of that tradition to divide themselves off from the masses of people in the society. A great example of this is in the case of Europe as a whole, where the aristocracy, who are essentially the elite, are a pan-European institution in the European context. They fight with each other, they marry each other, but they tend often to be from very, very different places from the places that they rule. They're culturally very different from the people that they rule. A good example of it is in World War I, where you can see the lineage of this. Nicholas II of Russia is fighting Wilhelm II of Germany. Nicholas is allied with George V of the British Empire, and they're all cousins, right? They're all from the same German family. And the aristocracy in that pre-modern, pre-national context would have never identified with the peasants that they ruled. In that sense, there would have never been an idea that we are culturally somehow the same as the peasants. There was a radical distinction culturally between the aristocratic elite, whose culture was actually pan-European, and very, very local peasant traditions and cultures on the other hand. Right? So that's a way of understanding how the pre-modern world was not really national and so international. My best example of that is to talk a little bit about the early relationship between the Safavid Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And it always strikes me how, I'm myself originally from Iran, and when people talk about these empires, somehow they think that they're talking in a pre-modern context about Turkey versus Iran, the Ottoman Empire versus the Safavid Empire. And I want to talk to you just about one episode which shows how this way of thinking in national terms and so in international terms before the pre-modern period just doesn't really make sense when you look at the Ottomans and the Safavids and how they thought about themselves. So this is Sultan Selim I, one of the most important of the Ottoman sultans, who ruled between 1512 and 1520. And he's incredibly important because he conquered Egypt and took the holy cities from the Mamluks. This is the keys of the holy cities being presented to him. And it's after this that the Ottomans actually appropriate and take over the title of caliph, so making the claim to supremacy, supreme sovereignty over all Muslims. On the other hand, this is Shah Ismail, who was actually the founder of the Safavid Empire. And when I was growing up in Iran, people would think that, people always said to me, the reason why Iranians are Shia is that when the Arabs conquered us, not only did we keep our own language, but we essentially decided on a different version of Islam, which is basically our way of keeping our nationality and showing how we were separate and autonomous from the Arabs. The reality is that the vast majority of Iranians continued to be Sunni until the 16th century, the 16th and 17th century, when the Safavids began the process of turning over the whole population to Shia Islam. And they did it precisely because they wanted to make a division between the Shia Safavid Empire versus the Sunni Ottoman Empire. So that's fundamentally the ways in which the Ottomans and the Safavids saw each other and their conflict with each other. But in ethnic terms, Shah Ismail was ethnically Azeri Turkish, and the Safavids came in from the north and took over the Iranian plateau. And the episode that I'm going to tell you about basically revolves around this fact that ethnically the Safavids and the people who conquered Iran and created the Safavid empires were not ethnically Iranian. Shah Ismail himself was actually a great stylist of Azeri Turkish, and there was a great battle between the Ottomans and the Safavids in 1514 at Chaldiran. You can see it's that white star over there. And before this battle, there was an exchange of letters between, a famous exchange of letters between Shah Ismail and Sultan Selim I. And Shah Ismail started the exchange, and he wrote Selim in Azeri Turkish, saying that he was going to defeat him and how horrible it was going to be for the Ottomans. And Selim wrote him back in Farsi. He wrote him back in Persian. Why would he do that? He would do that partly because Farsi and Persian had been court language, language of literature in the courts, with a long history behind it. It was also, for example, the court language of the Mughal Empire. And by writing him back in Farsi and in Persian, he was basically saying, you're writing me in Turkish, which shows, how small time and pathetic you are, and I'm going to write you back in a real court language, right? Again, which makes a mockery of the idea that somehow the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids are somehow some stand-in for Iran versus Turkey in the pre-modern period. So now I'm going to go very, very quickly to talk about then where does a nation state come from in world history, and how does it become a global institution? So when historians talk about the development of the nation state, The first example of the first nation state in world history is essentially France after the French Revolution. There's, the famous episode in the French Revolution is when the general estates in France, those meetings of, these were called parliaments in medieval Europe, which were organized according to estates. So the same hierarchy that I was telling you in society, the first estate in a European context was the church in Catholic, in Christendom. The second was the aristocracy, and the third were the town dwellers, the bourgeoisie, and the peasants didn't, in the medieval context, didn't have any representation whatsoever, but people voted by their orders, right? In the French Revolution, those estates came together as a general estates, and the third estate broke away and called itself the National Assembly, right? So moving from those hierarchical estates to now the idea of the nation, and it was made clear what that meant in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was passed by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789, which the first article of which basically said all men are equal. If there are any social distinctions in society, that can only be justified on the basis of social utility, as opposed to that inherent hierarchy of agricultural societies, which was thought to be basically built into the nature of things. And the third article said, it is the people, it is the nation that is sovereign, and so the nation is the basis of all political legitimacy and of the state. So now you had this equation of the state equals the people equals the nation. Before, when France was a kingdom, the way in which the state was conceived of was as many, many different territories, provinces with their own laws, their own customs, all of which were tied to the French king. And the French revolutionaries recreated France as the united nation state of the French people, right? They even maintained for a while the institution of the monarchy, but the monarchy, Louis XVI was from here on no longer to be the king of France, but king of the French. Even the guillotine in the French Revolution was a marker of this kind of equality. There would be equality even in execution and death, because before this, aristocrats had the privilege of being executed by the sword, whereas commoners would be executed by axe. Now the guillotine killed everyone equally. This is the execution of Louis XVI. So, very, very quickly, how is it that we move from that very, very hierarchical society that thought of the whole world in terms of binaries to nation states and their much more horizontal way of thinking about identity and egalitarian identity, which is nationality and national culture. So one explanation that social theorists and historians usually talk about is that precisely the fact that those were agricultural societies and in which hierarchies were essentially fixed, specializations in society were very, very fixed, and the whole point of these societies was to maintain the order of society exactly as it was. So they were societies that wanted stability and were committed to stability over everything else. This is why everybody within the hierarchy was given their own space, their own role in the world, and it was thought that this was basically built into the nature of things, built into how God essentially envisioned the world and what everybody's role was supposed to be. So that if you were born something, it may not have been wonderful, but that was essentially your purpose in life. But by the time that we come to the French Revolution, society, European society, is transforming itself radically and moving towards a commercial and increasingly then in the next century an industrial society, which is a society by contrast which is actually committed to constant mobility and to constant growth and to the constant changing of specializations in society. And one explanation then for the rise of the idea of a national culture is as now a universal literate culture, as opposed to only an elite essentially holding having access to literacy. Now the whole society essentially has to have access to literacy, because it's only on that basis and on that capacity for communication and education that you could have such a mobile society with constantly changing specializations. Otherwise, it would essentially not be possible. And in an inherently mobile society, you couldn't really have anything other than an egalitarian society, because you couldn't tell people that the role that they had in society was somehow the way the world was, because the world is essentially constantly changing and growing in this context. And the universal then literate idiom of people becomes what we call national culture, and that's why we have an egalitarian kind of idea. A more concrete story of why the nation state develops has to do with the role of modern states in the European context. This is Louis XIV, these nice high heels. And these states essentially in the early modern European context, this is about a century before the French Revolution, were already in the process of revolutionizing society. These states were already breaking down those corporate estates in society, like the church and the aristocracy, and the third estate basically as representing all of these tiny little different towns in the realm. So instead, during the wars of religion in the European context, religion eventually becomes an internal matter of each state. If you guys have been to Versailles, you see Louis XIV built Versailles and brought all of the higher aristocracy in France to Versailles. So as opposed to in the medieval period when they were ruling all of the different areas of France, now they came to Versailles. A central bureaucracy started to control much of the kingdom, whereas the higher aristocracy thought of their power in terms of who was helping Louis XIV put on his shoes in Versailles, right? Instead, you had much more centralized bureaucratic order that was created. And at the same time, all of those divisions between towns, Louis did as much as he could to try to erase those kinds of barriers between towns and to create the whole space of the state as much more of a common market than it had ever been before. And so the idea is that by destroying all of those corporate identities and institutions, at least by weakening them, these kinds of modern states anticipated then what was going to come in the French Revolution, because they essentially individualized people, made them much more mobile than they had ever been before, and so created, the word even society comes from this period in the 18th century to describe the idea of private relationships between individuals, with the state standing outside of society as a whole. And it's that society which becomes then the locus of this kind of individuals, which becomes the locus of a national identity, an egalitarian identity, which then comes in the French Revolution to claim state power. why does the nation state become actually the dominant type of state in the European context in the 19th century? Most dynastic states actually fought the idea of the nation state and the nationality for the first half of the 19th century. It's very understandable why, because they didn't want to rule in the name of the people. Legitimacy had come from above, not from below. And not only that, they were ruling dynastic states, so many different groups of people in so many different places. So now the idea of nationality and national culture, which starts to get created in this context, that very idea was so dangerous to all dynastic states. But the reason why the nation state really wins out is because for the first time in world history, the masses are brought into the political process in such a way that they are armed, so that what had been the monopoly of an elite in all previous states now becomes something that the masses of people, you give arms to them, they are able to mobilize for war, which makes the nation state so much more powerful than any kind of state that had existed to this period. It allowed the French revolutionaries, and you see here Napoleon at the end of it, to dominate the continent of Europe for essentially a generation. And by the second half of the 19th century, all of the dynastic states basically had the understanding that either they were going to become nation states or they were going to go down to defeat in one way or another. So this is Bismarck in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles in 1871, when the first German nation state comes into being. There's been no Germany essentially in world history up to this point. And it's the way in which Prussia as a dynastic state becomes instead the makes itself into a kernel of a nation state. States that are able to do this are able essentially to survive. And those that are not, like the multinational empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, which are made up of such radically different peoples, these are the empires that go down to defeat in the First World War. How does a nation state become a global institution from the European context? Essentially, this has to do with the processes of European imperialism. Basically, when I teach the history of international relations, I say the very idea of international relations is a very Eurocentric concept. It's a Eurocentric concept which, through the processes of imperialism, becomes then a global institution. These are all of the European empires. You can look at all of the areas in green, which are it's the British Empire, which by the First World War directly was ruling about 25% of the world's population and indirectly about a third of the world's population. And in the process of decolonization in the 20th century, essentially the very same idea of nationality, in the name of which Europeans had taken over so much of the world, then becomes utilized by the people that they've conquered, then to claim autonomy for themselves. So that nationality becomes a global institution. Where are we today, essentially? And why am I talking about are we now at the end of international relations? By the end of the 19th century, the end of the 19th century is really the first global era of human history. People think that globalization is happening now. But really, the first global economy was created by the end of the 19th century. And that had a lot to do with why Europeans went out into this massive imperial rivalry and competition at the end of the 19th century with each other, which was one of the causes of the First World War. So in trying to deal with essentially a global economic themselves from global competition. An era of free trade in European history was replaced by all kinds of high tariffs, and people then also tried to create as much territory as they could to protect themselves from global competition and global reality. And then by the aftermath of the First World War, you essentially already have global ideologies, which as much as nationalities are starting to be the basis of legitimacy in states. So capitalism and communism, these are essentially internationalist ideologies as much as they assume the existence of nationalities as well. So even the Soviet Union, which is an international state, is based on national Soviet republics, but it's making an international ideological claim. And even Nazi Germany, for example, is making a kind of global ideological claim to the supremacy of the Aryan race over the whole world. So that by the middle of the 20th century, we're already talking about the rise of global ideologies, but the contest between the two fundamental ideologies of the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century, between communism and capitalism, this Cold War fight was usually fought in terms of each side claiming that they were liberating or giving power to different the peoples and the nations in the context of so Cold War imperialism, as opposed to the imperialism of the end of the 19th century, happened in the names of nationalities and peoples rather than against them. Obviously, it didn't actually give them actual control in the world, but it was done in their name. And that's the way in which the nation state, partly with decolonization, became essentially a global institution. The irony being that the United States, which held on much more to the trying to make sure and support the Western European powers, which were the imperialist powers, meant that a lot of the third world nationalism and attempts at autonomy were driven towards Marxist and socialist ideologies to be able to do that. So in the aftermath of the Cold War, why am I saying that we're moving now essentially towards new post-national possibilities and post-national identities? Now that the context between these global ideologies done in the name of the liberation of peoples and nations is no longer there. One of my examples, I mean the most prominent one, obviously would be the European Union itself. The very fact that the United States essentially brought peace to Western Europe allowed for these states to coalesce much more into a union and into something which moved beyond simply the national state to something larger than the national state, which is essentially the European Union today. This is one example of a post-national institution and possibility in today's world. Another example, I think, would be Islamist politics in the Middle East and in Muslim countries around the world. Because while the masses in the European context usually were brought into the political process through the language of nationalism, usually in the Middle East and in many Muslim countries, nationalism tended to be the project much more of European and westernized, Western educated elites, so that now, as in the last few decades, more and more people have become involved in the political process in these countries. They've tended to do it through an Islamist language. And a final example would actually be the United States in its foreign policy and relationship with the whole world, so that after the Cold War, there was this real, this idea that now liberalism has triumphed and is going to take over the whole world. And many US interventions around the world were justified on that basis. And when they didn't go well, American foreign policy thinkers started to talk about and to focus on the idea of clash of civilizations, essentially. That there's a clash of civilization possibly between, for example, the West and Islam, which is also a post-national way of thinking about what you can call international relations. So essentially, the world of international relations and the categories of it, I'm trying to argue, are moving under our feet, are changing in the present world. And I can't quite say what the future of it will be, but that we're no longer essentially in the international world that was created between the French Revolution and the end of Cold War. So,
Shall we start with questions?
yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I want to push you a bit on the differentiation between international relations and let's call them interpolity relations. Now, on a fundamental level, I do agree with you, simply because the industrial, the industrial civilization is completely different from agricultural civilization. However, from what I took from your talk, we can say that pre-industrial societies and civilizations have three characteristics when it comes to their interpolity relations. Can I use that term?
In their interstate relationships, you can say. If they're, if you want to talk about
you could problematize the idea of the state even in that sense.
Sure.
First is universalism, a universal idea that unites and gives them the legitimacy to claim we are the world. Second is hierarchy.
Yes.
And third is the idea that the other is a barbarian who is either to be kept away or will, come and become part of us on his or her own will.
Sure. I mean, in the Chinese case, I think it's barbarian because the Chinese didn't necessarily have the idea of taking over the whole world. And in the case of the universal religious empires, they were potential converts.
Right.
Basically.
The potential converts.
They were people who could be brought into the empire. Yes.
I'm going to push a bit by making the case that what you call the international system is really just one of those civilizational systems that just conquered everybody. Let's start by the idea of universalism. On a fundamental level, the European and then global system that developed or made had universal ideas and universal protections, essentially enlightenment. Whether, you take the left-wing version of, whether you're with the Girondins or with the Jacobins, essentially, the basic, foundation is the same. It's this idea of, a utilitarian, practical world of equality and so on, which everybody can become a part of and which everybody will become a part of.
Okay.
And,
Okay, can I say just that I agree with you?
Yes.
I don't disagree. I mean,
Right.
I think the international world was a European idea and construct which took over.
Which became global.
I wouldn't call it an empire in that
Right.
in that same way, since it didn't necessarily function. The Europeans didn't have this idea, I think, of we're the ones who have the right access to God versus the people who don't, or we have the right understanding of the cosmos and people who don't. I think their fundamental way of thinking was in a new way of thinking about progress and modernity, that we are ahead while they are backward. So I think this is the fundamental division that brings Europeans together against essentially all others, which is something different from those empires that I was talking about, but the fact that they shared this international world in this idea of progress and move towards perpetual growth, and they're being now ahead of everybody else. In that sense, there was a Europe and the idea of Europe against the rest of the world.
So religion had a lot to do with that expansion. The English Empire is the classical example where religion drove equally the empire, and there was a belief that for religious as well as national reasons, we, the British, will civilize the world. But, let me go to the point of hierarchy. You make the point about equality as one of the central tenets of the international system, and there is truth in that. But at the same time, there's a schizophrenia in it. Don't you think? Like one of the foundational constitutions, let's say, of this system, the Vienna Congress, obviously openly talked about major powers that have a special role, And you know, that is a theme that continued in the League of Nations, and a theme we have today with the United Nations Security Council. So what I'm trying to get is that while I agree with you about the differences, I'm not so sure, like, once you essentialize it, how much this international is really
Look,
that much of a difference.
There are you know, most of people's identities, and most of them are based on fictions of one kind
of
or
course.
another. Yes, the idea that all nation states are sovereign and essentially equal on that basis, you know, when the world rose up, when the European continent rose up in 1848 as a group of, you know, national peoples essentially, who were going to create maybe a world on that, they all, you know, they were defeated essentially horribly, and it was the dynastic states who essentially made the international world in their own image. And imperialism was based, showed nationality was a question of rivalry, which is then why the masses of people becoming part of the nation actually led to world war. So absolutely, even with the idea of religion, I think the idea of the nation state has this idea that comes essentially out of the Protestant Reformation. The idea that religion is something universal but private, whereas the state is national and public, and this is a normative way of thinking about nationality and its relationship to religion, while obviously that is not necessarily the way that it's worked out. But I think these were, I mean, I think the fictions are actually important. The contradictions with the fictions are what drive the historical process essentially forward. But the fictions themselves are because that's how the idea of the universal religious empires were themselves fictions, because you could see so many different states making the same kind of global claims. But how can you come to have these kinds of dominant fictions? I think that's the important.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? But if you'd like to clap and leave, also you can.
Actually, they will have to leave because they have other classes in 10 minutes. But I would like to thank you for making time to come here.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
Small little thing.